What man dared to unite entire kingdoms under one crown, defying time itself? The thunder of cathedral bells mingled with the march of Charlemagne's warriors across rain-soaked fields. Let this imperial saga carry you into a restful sleep, and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1. The Cradle of an Empire. Part 1. The Dawn of a Destiny. The day broke over the vast Burgundian horizon, bathing the plain in a golden light that danced on the tall grasses like a promise. At the edge of the Langris forest, the distant sound of a horn rang out, deep and solemn. It pierced the cool morning air, awakening the still drowsy birds and making the ferns quiver. In this almost supernatural setting, history was about to write its first lines for a young king with a prodigious destiny. At the heart of Pepin, the Short's court, the father of the child, a restrained fervor reigned. Tents were being set up. Banners bearing the imperial bust were adjusted, and stretchers laden with provisions were carried. The acrid smell of new leather mingled with the smoke of campfires, while sharp minds, clerics and warriors, approached the royal pavilion. The noble sculptor Eusebius, whose hands shaped stone as a poet wields words, respectfully placed a small statuette carved from alder wood, a depiction of an eagle with outstretched wings, the emblem of the Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne, barely 18 years old, stood before his tent, his golden hair caressed by a breeze. His steel blue eyes scanned the horizon with devouring determination. Around him, an imposing stag carved into the rock, a remnant of an ancient Celtic temple, imbued the atmosphere with mystery. Exiled druids still whispered incantations in the language of their ancestors, invoking the spirits of the forest to guide the young prince toward his destiny. Charlemagne's gaze rested for a moment on his sword, planted in an oak block. Its blade, etched with inscriptions in Old High German, caught the reflections of the rising sun. It was said to have been tempered in the waters of the Aar River and blessed by a wandering bishop, St. Arbogast, during a secret pilgrimage. At that moment, the steel seemed to hum with an energy of its own, as if the weapon awaited its master to fully reveal itself. A murmur ran through the assembly when a herald, clad in azure and gold, stepped forward. His voice, deep and meditative, resounded like a tolling bell. Faithful vassals, brothers in arms, and worthy lords, our sovereign Pepin, in his wisdom, entrusts today to his son Charles the charge of governing this kingdom beyond the Rhine and unto the lands of the Lombards. May peace and justice dwell in his reign. The silence that followed was of an almost tangible intensity. The crackling of dying embers fell silent. The horses stirred, and even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then Charlemagne stepped forward, solemn, and the herald presented him with the crown of fleur-de-lis and pure gold, a masterful work of Merovingian goldsmiths. The diadem rested on a purple velvet cushion, held by two young pages with pounding hearts. Each pearl encrusted in the crown caught the light with dazzling clarity, reminiscent of the stars that would soon guide the emperor on his march toward greatness. At the precise moment the crown touched his brow, a low rumble rose in the sky. The clouds, until then scattered, gathered in tumultuous swirls, casting a fleeting shadow over the faces of the witnesses. Some saw it as a portent of a troubled reign, others as the announcement of a new era, shaped by the hand of a man whose will defied the gods. A lightning bolt, swift and silent, streaked across the sky, leaving a phosphorescent trace on the celestial vault. Charlemagne, unperturbed, bowed his head under the weight of the crown like a colossus bending beneath the blacksmith's hammer. In the sudden crackle of a bonfire lit in his honor, he spoke in a deep voice. "By the grace of the Most High and the wisdom of my ancestors, I swear to watch over this people, to render the justice demanded by virtue, and to defend the faith that enlightens our souls." The bells of the makeshift chapel then rang an ancestral Te Deum, their chimes echoing faintly, mingling with the romantic clamor of armor and banners. The entire world seemed suspended in that precise moment when a mere prince became the pivot of a nascent empire. Beneath his steps, the earth trembled as if to welcome the promise of a golden age. In the shadows, an old hermit with a weathered face observed the scene. His eyes, hidden beneath a dusty hood, gleamed with an immortal flame. He murmured ancient verse, heavy with gravity. "He who holds the blade of the heavens shall rule over men." Then he vanished, melting into the forest's twilight, carrying with him the secret of a prophecy destined to come true. Thus ended the first act of Charlemagne's imperial life in a setting steeped in the sacred and the mysterious, under the gaze of men and gods. The dawn of a destiny had risen, and none could yet fathom the extent to which its consequences would redraw the map of Europe. Part 2. The Baptism of the Prince. The Cathedral of Reims, vast as a mausoleum of ancient stones, pulsed with a solemn atmosphere on that autumn morning of the year 775. The high Gothic vaults, still in the infancy of their future splendor, echoed with the thin chant of psalms rising from the unfinished organ, like a hesitant prayer ascending to the celestial vault. The light filtered through the stained glass windows cast ruby and sapphire glints onto the floor's mosaics, tracing paths of shifting colors beneath the steps of clerics and chasubles. The scent of burnt wood and thick incense formed an almost tangible fragrance, imbued with fervor and mystery. Each column rose like a tower of strength, as if to bear the weight of the world and the secrets it held. At the far end of the nave, Prince Charles's procession advanced slowly. The Frankish guards, clad in weathered chainmail, formed a double rank, their helmets gleaming under the golden glow of the candles. Captive Lombard nobles, their hands bound with fine leather bracelets, followed at a distance, heads bowed, their gazes a mix of fear and admiration. With each movement, the hanging banners stirred in a breath of air, revealing the silver chevrons of the Carolingian house. Charlemagne, dressed in a white linen tunic embroidered with gold thread, advanced, supported by the archbishop and two dignitaries. His pale golden hair fell in light curls over his shoulders, and his clear blue eyes, charged with new-found determination, scanned the crowd gathered in the aisles. When Archbishop Hincmar took his place before the baptistery, an almost supernatural silence fell over the assembly. His face, weathered by years of councils and travels, bore the mark of uncontested authority. His mitre, encrusted with sapphires and pearls, caught the dancing reflections of the candles. He opened his arms, raising his pastoral staff, its metal cross ending in elegant volutes. In a deep voice, he pronounced the exhortation. Charles, son of the illustrious Pepin, receive today the sacred sign that binds you to Christ. May this water purify you. May this symbolic blood of the Lord strengthen your soul, and may the celestial crown become your guide. At these words, a deacon approached, carrying a chiseled golden chalice filled with holy water, said to have been drawn from the springs of the Meuse and sanctified during a pilgrimage to St. Martin. Hincmar dipped 3 fingers into the clear liquid, causing warm vapor to rise toward the vaults. He gently sprinkled Charles' forehead. Each drop, upon touching the royal skin, seemed to glow like a small flame, tracing a shining path across the prince's face. A faint breeze swept through the nave, as if the angels themselves held their breath. The prince closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold dampness and inner warmth mingle within him. The faint clink of swords and the rustle of velvets fell silent, giving way to a distant hum like the beating of invisible wings. In a shadowy corner, a young page held back tears, moved by the solemnity of the rite. Further off, a proud Lombard noblewoman, captive yet dignified, placed her hand on her heart, her fingers adorned with garnet rings. The scratch of a scribe's parchment echoed faintly, recording in the shadows the spiritual birth of the future emperor. Then came the moment of the chalice of red wine, symbol of Christ's blood and new-found strength. Hincmar raised the vessel to his lips, turned it 3 times in the air, and handed it to the prince. Charles, with a measured gesture, brought the chalice to his lips. The warm aroma of the wine filled the space, blending the sweetness of the vine with spices brought from distant lands. A slight shiver ran through the crowd at that moment. The dark, deep wine seemed to carry the promise of both earthly and celestial sovereignty. When the chalice was set down, 6 bishops approached and formed a circle around the prince. One by one, they placed their hands on his shoulder, their gold and copper mitres reflecting the candle flames in prismatic bursts. With each touch, an invisible wave spread. Some swore they felt a gentle warmth fill the air, others a chilling shiver, an echo of ancient power. A guttural chant, modulated by deep voices, rose then, an ancient Frankish hymn translating the people's hope and fear into minor chords. When the last bishop had laid his hand, Hincmar raised his arms and, in a loud voice, concluded the ceremony. By this baptism, you become a light among the nations, guardian of justice and protector of the humble. May your reign bring justice and peace, and may your sword be guided by faith. A distant roll of drums, perhaps the echo of a portent, seemed to answer the prelate's final word. Emerging from the cathedral, Charles was greeted by a square bathed in gray, rustling light. The wings of a raven, perched on the statue of Saint Remy, clapped in the wind, its cry piercing the air as if bearing a warning or farewell. The prince, still marked by the dampness of the sacred water, raised his eyes to the cloudy sky and let out a sigh laden with promises. Around him, the Frankish lords bowed their heads, and the silent Lombard captives understood that a new aura shone in him more than paternal authority. the aura of a blessed and feared king on the threshold of the divine. Thus ended the baptism of Prince Charles. The echo of the hymn's final notes faded into the distant rumble of thunder, while beyond the crenellated towers, destiny was slowly written, drop by drop, in iron and faith. Part 3. The Forges of Power. At the heart of the Moselle Valley, just before dawn, the flickering glow of embers danced on the forge's walls like an inner fire that would never die. The stone and ancient wood huts exhaled thick smoke of charcoal and resin rising in dark swirls to the first morning mists. The steady hammering of mallets on the anvil resounded, a dull echo of a heart beating to the rhythm of creation. The ground was carpeted with gray ashes, and a few glowing steel shavings crackled as they fell, like dying shooting stars. The air, saturated with an almost tangible heat, made the blacksmiths' faces shimmer, baking their sweat into an ochre patina that glossed their weathered brows. Charlemagne arrived in the forge's courtyard, draped in a thick, dark linen mantle, edged with a purple braid, which absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. His iron-shod brown leather boots crunched on the uneven flagstones, and his gaze lingered on every detail, the trapezoidal shape of the anvil, the steel bars aligned like a silent army, and the focused faces of the artisans, frozen in effort. At his side, Gondomar, a Visigothic master blacksmith with weathered skin and arms like pillars, turned and bowed reservedly. Beneath his patched tunic, one could discern the bulging muscles of a man accustomed to taming the most stubborn metal beasts. "Sire," said Gondomar in a hoarse voice, "mine must be the final hammer blow. See how the steel lightens with each dip in oil, ready to receive its final tempering." Charlemagne nodded, his blond hair waving over his collar. He approached the oil lamp, illuminating the blade in its warm charcoal sheath. The metal gleamed, half blackened, half white, like a lunar dawn. The young king knelt, touched the nearly finished edge with his fingertips, and seemed to listen to the faint song of the steel. At that moment, a tremor ran through the blade as if it resonated in harmony with his own soul. In a muffled cry, Gondomar raised the hammer and delivered a final blow, a coup de grace, that pinned the blade to the anvil. The impact echoed through the valley, tearing the silence like a thunderclap. The hammers fell silent, all eyes turned to the sacred object, and the night's breath, held until then, seemed to exhale at last in a damp breeze. The blade, now straight and perfect, exuded a trembling aura, half supernatural, half earthly. Charlemagne took it in both hands, felt its balanced weight, and held it before him as one wields a scepter. "Joyeuse," he murmured, breaking the silence. At the pronounced name, a faint echo resounded, like the quiver of a distant bell. The blacksmiths exchanged glances of astonishment and respect. Naming a weapon was to affirm it possessed a will of its own. Sparks flew suddenly as the blade grazed the damp stone floor, as if answering the call of ancient metal. At the back of the forge, a small group of clerics, cloaked in their burlap capes, recorded each step of the process on fragile parchments. One of them, Abo, whose voice was as soft as candlelight, approached and offered his bronze inkwell. His slender fingers trembled with the fervor of the moment. He inscribed on the vellum the runes chosen to adorn the guard and hilt, Frankish sigils mixed with older Visigothic characters, sealing the alliance of peoples under the aegis of steel. "May the blade bring peace or justice," he wrote, "according to the hand that wields it." While Ebo wrote, Hinchmar of Rams entered the workshop, wearing a broad purple cloak edged with white fur. He advanced slowly, each step carrying the solemnity of a sacred rite. Reaching the prince, he placed a small vial of holy oil, both profane and divine, on the blade. With a measured gesture, he poured the precious liquid onto the still warm iron. White steam rose in a sacred cloud, filling the air with fragrances of myrrh and cedar. "May your hand be firm and your heart steadfast," pronounced the bishop. "May this sword, dedicated today to the armies of God and men, serve both the balance of justice and the shield of the weak." The final murmur resonated in the forge like a millennial incantation. Charles closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and felt the subtle vibration of the entire weapon. The weight of the blade, the balance of the cross-guard, the precise engraving of the runes humming beneath his palm. He bowed his head, then, in a fluid motion, pointed the blade toward the dusky sky, where dust-laden clouds still swirled. "By this sword," he said, "I swear to defend peace and subdue the arrogance of tyrants." The blacksmiths knelt, the cleric's quills ceased their dance on the parchment, and the embers burst in a final golden flare. In the ambient crackle, some swore they heard, for a brief moment, the sound of a child's laughter, as if the blade had been endowed with a voice of its own, ready to whisper counsel to the king in the din of battles. As the informal ceremony drew to a close, the Frankish guards lined up at the forge's entrance raised their halberds in a martial salute. The metal gleamed in the collective twilight, a reminder that the empire's strength now rested on a chosen ally, a legendary sword, forged in the heat of fire, the water of tempering, and the blessing of the heavens. Charlemagne sheathed Joyeuse in its leather scabbard lined with velvet, its silver ferrule bearing the same runes of peace inscribed on the guard. He walked away, his step light despite the weapon's weight, leaving behind the forge and its smoldering ashes, the material cradle of a power yet to come, ready to extend over kingdoms still unknown. In the distance, the valley caught its breath, and the world, as if shaped in the secrecy of workshops, prepared for the new era heralded by the hammering of metal and the oath of a prince become emperor. Chapter 2. The Conquest of Kingdoms. Part 1. The Call of the Franks. At daybreak, the morning mist draped the plain of worms in a milky veil like a carpet of silence ready to be torn by the clash of armies. The first rays of dawn filtered through the masts, bearing the Carolingian banners, a golden eagle on a field of gules, symbol of nascent sovereignty. War horns then sounded, long and deep, shaking the place's tranquility. They were blown by robust masked heralds, whose hoarse voices carried the announcement to every corner of the plain. The ground, covered with damp grass, gave a muffled crunch under the hesitant steps of cavaliers from Neustria, Austrasia, or Burgundy. The air carried the acrid smell of metal heated by fire and oiled leather, the breath of horses condensed into white swirls. Grooms, bundled in woolen breeches, adjusted stirrup straps, while squires, capes thrown over their shoulders, fussed over the horses' shoes to shake off dust and nocturnal chill. Amid this bustling hive, Charlemagne stood on an improvised platform, wearing an ornate helmet, his chainmail still steaming from the previous day. His silver-threaded cloak trailed on the wooden floor, and he observed his warriors with a clear, unyielding gaze. There was a moment of silence so profound that the clatter of hooves on wood could be heard. Then, in a deep and steady voice, he addressed his faithful. "Sons of Clovis, brothers in arms, this day marks the awakening of faith and iron under our banner. The Saxons rise in the east, profaning sanctuaries and breaking the peace we have forged. To you, warriors of Francia, I entrust the mission to restore order and make divine justice flourish beyond the Rhine." A mighty cry rose from the ranks, a polyphonic neigh mingled with the clash of drawn swords. The blades clashed, producing a warlike melody, while shields, struck with closed fists, vibrated like a primal drum. At the camp's edge, an old bard, a frail silhouette draped in blue velvet, plucked the strings of a lyre. His dissonant notes mingled with the tumult like a disturbing counterpoint, evoking the omens of ancient Germanic poets. At the foot of the platform, Hruetgar, Duke of Austrasia, placed his hand on his sword. His features, weathered by Lorraine winters, bore the gravity of duty. "Sire," he said, "our bands are ready. The Saxon thralls already water their burned roofs with tears. We will march at your side with valiant hearts and raised axes." Charlemagne nodded, and the wind then toppled a banner. A lurking wolf could be seen, a symbol of the united pack. This image rekindled the warrior's ardor, provoking a rumble of recognition that made the air tremble like the echo of a storm about to break. The horn sounded again, more strident, and a cohort of flying herrings, archers of Carpathian origin who had joined the Frankish guard, loosed a volley of smoking arrows toward the surrounding hills, marking the true start of the campaign. Heavy wagons laden with provisions and hides creaked at the camp's edge, their wheels grinding on pebbles. The Carolingian stewards, wearing conical caps, managed rations of brown bread, spiced sausage, and fermented cabbage. Further off, under a crimson tent, the chaplain Alcuin of York recited the Gospels, enveloping the atmosphere in paradoxical softness, while the warrior's sweat testified to the tension of departure. Suddenly, in a light crackle, a foghorn rose from the dark woods, the agreed signal to launch the first reconnaissance attack. Patrols set out in silence, their shoes crunching on wet ferns, their spears brushing mossy trunks. A young page, tossing his brandy in a gesture of bravado, provoked a mocking jibe from a seasoned warrior. "Save your fire for the fight, lad. Here, only courage keeps you warm." The convoy moved out of the plain, following the eroded Roman road, its paving stones sometimes lifted by the ancient roots of century-old elms. Birds of prey, black raptors with hooked claws, flew over the column, motionless silhouettes in the gray dawn. Some saw in them the shadow of Odin himself, guarantor of men's destinies. Two exiled druids clad in deer hides murmured incantations in old High German, imploring the protection of sylvan spirits. The caravan stopped at last near an old stone bridge built under Augustus, spanning the Nahe. The water sparkled in crystalline bursts, reminding the Franks of the obligatory passage to the other bank, where war awaited. Charlemagne, raising his sword above his head, issued a final call. May this blade be the torch of faith and the sword of justice for our dead, for our children, for the glory of God. A tremendous roar answered this call, so powerful that the echo tore through the hills. The banners rose, the cavalry charged at a gallop, and the infantry, barefoot or clad in leather armor, crossed the bridge, the starting point of a ride that would mark history. The horses leaped, raising clouds of ochre dust, and the clash of iron against stone rang like a knell. Thus began the call of the Franks, an indissoluble alliance between a king with a fiery gaze and a people of warriors with ardent hearts. And as the plain of worms receded behind them, carrying away the calm before the storm, each knew that this decisive day would write a new chapter in the Carolingian legend, born by the breath of horns and the unshakable faith of those who answered the call. Part 2. The Lombard Campaign. When Charlemagne crossed the Alpine frontier for the first time, it was at the moment when dawn tinged the snow-capped peaks pink. The rugged passes, carved by millennia of snow, seemed to watch over the kingdom of Italy like ancient stone giants. The Imperial procession advanced in single file, the heavy wagons creaking on uneven paving stones, while ropes of local guides, bundled in bearskins, led the way. The sharp air whipped the warriors' faces, numbing their fingers despite leather gloves, and the rocky ridges echoed the beat of the drum that marked their steps. At each turn, their gaze turned south, toward the Lombard valley where Pavia stood, the deep enemy fortress, guardian of an ancient kingdom. The passage was marked by an impetuous omen. A storm of unprecedented violence broke over the mountain's flanks, streaking the sky with supernatural glows and rolling thunder so powerful that the horses neighed in panic. Several foot soldiers fell to their knees, shaken by the sacred fear such a spectacle inspired. Charlemagne, however, upright on his war horse, firmly gripped the reins, his gaze fixed on the stormy horizon. In a cry that pierced the air, "Let the gods of the heavens bear witness to our just cause!" And against all expectation, the thunder seemed to answer him like a tacit agreement, before fading into a distant rumble. The descent into the Lombard plain revealed a landscape of silver olive trees and gnarled oaks, their trunks twisted by the Mediterranean wind. Villages perched on hills seemed suspended between sky and earth, silent guardians of a land contested for generations. Everywhere, Byzantine crosses and ancient marble tombs stood, remnants of an era before the Franks. Scouts first reported beehives where Lombard peasants toiled, then entire deserted hamlets, their doors broken and livestock gone, harbingers of fierce resistance or hasty flight. On the 5th day of the march, the camp settled near the Ticino, where the wide, powerful river flowed in a slow blue melody. Frankish pontooners, equipped with wood and rope, built a temporary bridge, while empty barges glided under the arches, ready to carry heavy trebuchets and siege engines. The guttural chants of the workers, sung in Old Frankish, mingled with the rustle of oars and the lapping of water. Charlemagne, inspecting the works, exchanged a discreet word with his chief engineer, a renegade Lombard named Ansprand, whose skilled fingers had already built fortifications to crown the king's cursus honorum. Once the camp was established on the opposite bank, siege towers rose like metal trees. Frameworks of spears and stretchers pointed toward the sky. Women and children in the camp, refugees and captives from the first wave, watched in silence, their hearts heavy, their eyes wavering between fear and admiration. Under the crimson command tent, Charlemagne was already planning the assault. By the flickering light of oil lamps, he traced Pavia's ramparts on a wax tablet, assessing the wall's weaknesses and blind spots where efforts should focus. A tactical genius unfolded in his mind, a simultaneous deployment of infantry and artillery, accompanied by a diversion led by Saxon archers. When the trebuchets, mounted on elevated platforms, began battering the Lombard watchtowers, a sinister whistle echoed across the plain. The flaming, roaring projectiles tore through the night, igniting palisades and casting dancing shadows on the battlements. A cry of panic rose from the shaken walls. In a superhuman surge, Charlemagne crossed the smoke-covered bridge, crowned by the red glow of catapult fires, and faced Desiderius himself, the Lombard king, who had mounted the rampart to rally his defenders. The two sovereigns locked eyes, separated by the abyss of weapons and cries. "Charlemagne!" cried Desiderius in a hoarse voice vibrant with defiance. "Your weapons will not break the faith of my subjects." "Your walls will fall if your heart does not yield," replied the Frankish king, his jaw clenched, his steel gaze cutting like a blade. "I give you the chance to save your people from inevitable ruin." Silence fell like a leaden shroud. Then the Lombard sentinels answered their king by hurling javelins that ricocheted off Frankish helmets. A furious assault ensued. The Frankish infantry, driven by the war cry, "Dios lo vult," trampled the sodden ground, while knights crossed the moats on fire-scorched wooden gangways. The clash of arms, the smell of heated iron, the cries of wounded men, and the groans of horses created an apocalyptic atmosphere, so intense it seemed the Armageddon had descended on the plain. The assault ended only at dawn, when the last bastion yielded under the repeated blows of the Frankish ram. The oak gates, warped by titanic effort, collapsed in a burst of splintered wood. The exhausted Lombard defenders climbed the great masts, pleading with Charlemagne for mercy. The young king, standing on a crumbled rampart, raised his hand and, with a slow gesture, ordered silence. In the eyes of the vanquished, he saw both the pride of a defeated king and the submission of a man forced to yield. "Today," he began, "I choose clemency over vengeance. Let Rome and God judge our actions, and may your people be reborn under the banner of Carolingian peace." A collective heartbeat pulsed through the crowd before relief came. Then Desiderius, humility and rage mingled, bowed before Charlemagne, and the motto, "Pax et Justitia," was engraved in golden letters on the broken walls of Pavia. The Lombard campaign ended in the echo of drums and the chants of clerics, heralding an era where the sword became the quill of history. Part 3. At the Frontiers of Islam. When Charlemagne's army reached the arid plains of the Ebro Valley, the land seemed bathed in a new fervor, intensified by the relentless heat of the Iberian sun. On the morning of May 1st, 778, The Frankish legionaries awoke under a crystalline blue sky, unmarred by clouds to temper their ardor. The wind, laden with sand and unfamiliar spices, raised golden clouds that advanced like a silent army, mingling the acrid scent of wild thyme with a heady aroma of bitter orange. The ochre walls of Saragossa loomed on the horizon, the focal point of the king's crusade, while beyond resounded the prayers of imams in Andalusian mosques. The Frankish camp sprawled beneath stunted olive trees where coarse canvas tents were hastily tied. Smoky braziers crackled constantly, fed by dry garrigue that sparked at the slightest flame. Butchers carved roasted mutton before the throng of soldiers, and greasy smoke sometimes veiled their weathered faces. At the camp's edge, a local hermit, a disciple of a mystical brotherhood, murmured a verse in ancient Arabic, speaking of a great king whose sword will bring light to the darkness. Some saw it as a favorable omen, others as the foretelling of a titanic confrontation. Charlemagne, draped in a dark green silk cloak brought from Constantinople, inspected the troops with the solemnity of a divine judge. At his side stood Roland, his nephew by blood, and his faithful friend Olivier, each clad in gleaming chainmail, their shields enamel bearing a cross. "May your hearts remain pure, and your blades never stained by an unjust cause," admonished the king in a deep voice that rose above the clinking of armor. At the sovereign's feet, a white horse, a gift from the emirs of Cordoba during a brief truce, neighed and shook its mane, as if affirming the hybrid nature of this war, both political and spiritual. The first contact occurred in the hills of Monzon. An Andalusian detachment emerged at dawn, bows drawn and quivers slung over their shoulders, fleeting silhouettes in the morning mist. The first arrows whistled, slicing the air with precision born of another art of war. The smell of charred bone and fresh blood filled the Franks' nostrils, while the ground became stained with dark red patches. In the melee, the floating mist turned into a bloody veil, where lances clashed like the claws of enraged felines. A local falconry, perched on a barren pine, let out hoarse cries, as if impassively observing the destinies of men. Soon, the main column arrived before the gates of Barcelona further south, where the inhabitants had sworn allegiance without resistance. Frankish and Andalusian negotiators agreed on a tribute, gold from the Aragon mines, in exchange for the safety of caravan routes. Like a sacrificial offering, coffers were filled with silver coins and sumptuous embroideries brought from the east. Charlemagne, standing at the center of the main square, gazed at these treasures laid on a black marble slab, as one might present an offering to ancient gods. The king murmured, "May the alliance be sealed by the word stronger than steel," before taking a vial of scented oil and touching the stone, fulfilling the Augustan rite of peace. But the rumor of a conspiracy woven by Suleiman al-Arabi, governor of Saragossa, soon reached the king's ears. The emir, fearing Frankish power, was said to have secretly invited the Basques to harass the column during its return north. Faced with this announced betrayal, Charlemagne summoned his counts at dusk, under the crimson cloth tent, lit by flickering oil lamps. The walls were hung with Persian carpets, their geometric patterns visible. With a slow gesture, the king traced a sketch of the return route on the ground, indicating narrow passes and exposed ridges. "If we are to return unscathed to Francia," he said, his brows furrowed. "We must beware of every outcrop, every creeping shadow." At his side, Roland gripped the handle of his Oliphant, ready to sound the alarm, while Olivier checked the tension of the crossbows. On July 15th, the return march began in the morning mist of the Pyrenees. The rocks, standing like silent sentinels, broke the light into silver shards. The cavalry entered the Roncevaux Pass, where the distant echo of torrents tumbling down the mountain could be heard. The air suddenly lost its Mediterranean warmth, taking on an alpine chill. The rumble of wagons against the rock sounded like a knell, while clouds gathered, forming dark swirls that snaked between the peaks. Some knights, pointing to the steep slopes, saw in them the shadow of a pack of living shadows ready to pounce. At the valley's highest point, the ambush erupted. Basque warriors sprang from the underbrush, axes and knives in hand, howling bestial cries. The shock was brutal. The column halted abruptly, horses reared, and the clash of arms instantly drowned out words. The wind suddenly swirled dead leaves as if the mountain rejected the intruder. In the tumult, Roland, brandishing his sword, slew 3 assailants single-handedly before being knocked out by a club blow. Olivier rushed to his aid, pulling him from the melee to safety. The battle lasted until dusk. The cries weakened, groans replaced screams, and blood seeped into the rock crevices, flowing in black rivulets. When the last Basque withdrew, silence fell, heavy as a grim augury. Charlemagne, standing on a flat stone, surveyed the carnage with an impenetrable gaze. His face, lit by the last ray of sunlight, seemed carved from granite. In a barely audible voice he said, "As long as shadow reigns, light will be reborn by our will." On the morning of July 16, 778, the column resumed its march, humbler, bearing the weight of the dead and the painful lesson of the frontier. Each step northward marked a new scar in the souls of the men. In the rustle of wounded hearts, each understood that this expedition would remain etched forever as the ordeal of the borders where worlds collide, Bible and Koran, iron and faith, in a tragic and majestic interweaving. Chapter 3. The Reign of Justice and Faith. Part 1. The Council of Paderborn. In the spring of the year of grace, 785, as buds burst into a symphony of nascent greens and the scent of broom filled the Westphalian meadows, a throng of monks and warriors converged on Paderborn. The roads, carrying the dust of winter, revealed here and there fields pierced by watering troughs where clear water murmured the secrets of ancient gods. On the horizon, the silhouette of the Dortmund Gate stood out, guardian of a kingdom whose peoples now demanded either peace or the law of the sword. At dawn, the city awoke under a slate sky streaked with fine spring rains. The wooden and clay shops, still damp, exhaled the scent of sap mingled with turned earth. Panels of oriental tapestries and Carolingian draperies hung from the facades, recounting in embroidery the triumph of the cross over paganism. At the center, the new church, built in the Byzantine style, rose like a silent colossus, its bell towers resembling blessing fingers pointing to the sky. In the great hall of the palace, the waxed oak benches groaned under the weight of lords and prelates. The air was laden with Arabian incense, its smoke curling around columns decorated with bas-reliefs evoking David and Goliath, symbols of a triumphant faith. The still fragile stained glass windows vibrated under the breath of the outside wind, casting blue and gold glints on the mosaic where the Lion of Judah and the Eucharistic chalice stood side by side. Each breath became a prayer. Each gaze weighed like an impending sentence. Charlemagne entered, draped in a purple tunic embroidered with gold, his cloak held by a chiseled eagle-shaped fibula. His step resounded, powerful and measured, on the black stone floor. He stopped at the center of the hall, under the silver cross suspended from the vault's apex, and raised his hand. A tomb-like silence fell. Even the birds in the nearby grove seemed to hold their song. In his gaze burned the indomitable flame of a sovereign intent on laying the foundations of a new order. Then, a rare phenomenon occurred. The solar disk, veiled by a thin cloud, darkened, casting a fleeting shadow over the lips of the assembly. The monks shuddered, murmuring that it was a celestial portent. Some feared divine punishment or an apocalyptic breath. Yet, in Charlemagne's gaze, the darkness kindled a spark of determination. He made the sign of the cross, and the light returned, as if confirming the will of the Most High to guide his steps. The king's voice then rang out, deep and firm. In the name of the Father and the Son, we have convened this council to abolish the last shadows of paganism and strengthen the Christian truth. Let none profane henceforth the solemnity of the laws we shall establish. The prelates, draped in purples and scarlets, bowed their heads, their chasubles swaying like the wings of a sacred bird. In their hands rested illuminated codices, guardians of ancient ecclesiastical knowledge. The decisions followed, each sharper than the last. The formal prohibition of all Druidic worship in Westphalia, the destruction of carved stone altars, the abolition of divinations by animal entrails. Offenders would be handed over to secular authorities, subject to corporal punishment or even death for priests hostile to the church. At the announcement of these sentences, a cold wind swept through the ranks. Some lords saw a bulwark against rebellion, others a sword hanging over their heads. In a corner of the hall, the scholar Alcuin of York leaned toward Archbishop Warren. "Majesty," he said in a low voice, "our task is not only to eradicate idolatry, but to enlighten hearts with sound doctrine. The sword is just, but the word must be sharper still." Warren nodded, his eyes shining with the faith that animated him. Behind them, a scribe recorded every word in squid ink, certain that these laws would endure 1,000 years. As the assembly caught its breath, a raven, black as the shadow of ancient gods, perched on a window frame. Its piercing gaze seemed to probe the king himself, as if judging the firmness of his convictions. A distant thunder rolled through the hills, and the rain began to patter on the thatched roofs. The most superstitious saw in it the wrath of Wotan, dead but still feared. Yet Charlemagne struck his sword against the platform with a sharp blow. "My strength comes from the heavens, not from the terrors of the old cult." The laws promulgated at Paderborn were numerous and precise. Prohibition of human sacrifice, moderation of penalties for witchcraft, mandatory baptism of Saxon converts within 3 days, standardization of liturgical chant according to the Roman rite. Each article was accompanied by a theological preamble, invoking the Church Fathers and the decisions of the Councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon. The parchments were sealed with red wax, stamped with Charlemagne's monogram seal, an indelible mark of imperial authority. When the final decree was pronounced, a solemn chant rose, intoned by the cathedral's canons. The low, grave voices lifted in a Te Deum that stirred hearts. The incense smoke dissipated into the vaults, and the bas-relief shadow turned into a golden halo around the cross. The vault's curve resonated like the belly of a sleeping dragon, a symbol of an old world ready to be transformed. At the end of the day, as the rain ceased and the sky cleared to pastel hues, Charlemagne stepped onto the square. He raised his gaze to the dissipating clouds and let out a sigh of satisfaction. Today, order has been restored, faith sanctified. Tomorrow, the light will spread from our cities to the dark refugees of rebellion. Around him, the vassals looked at him with renewed fervor. Thus ended the Council of Paderborn, a pounding act of the ideal reorganization of the Carolingian kingdom. Under the gaze of the now calmed heavens, Charlemagne had laid the first stone of a political and spiritual edifice, a sacred alliance of sword and scripture. The echo of these decisions resonated through the ages, forging the destiny of an empire that, far beyond rivers and mountains, would establish itself as the guardian of Christendom. Part 2. The Rooting of Law. In the early days of the year 787, the court of Aachen awoke under a low sky veiled with heavy clouds. The palace built by Charlemagne, vast as a labyrinth of marble and exotic wood, exhaled the acrid scent of fresh pigments and precious inks newly opened by copyists. In the great throne hall, the oak benches echoed with the measured steps of the Missi Dominici, those royal emissaries charged with carrying the king's word to the empire's farthest reaches. Their burlap and wool cloaks, embroidered with Carolingian arms, swept the dusty floor, tracing furrows of authority in the air laden with incense and promises. On the platform, Charlemagne, draped in purple, summoned the counts and bishops around a fan of parchments. The flickering light of chandeliers cast dancing shadows on his revered features, like a portent of justice to come. When he spoke, his deep voice resonated under the nascent Gothic vaults. So that peace and stability may reign, our laws must reach every village, every market, and every hearth. Eyes turned to a blank parchment roll, soon adorned with the first capitularies, collections of decrees aimed at standardizing law throughout the empire. At long tables, clerics crowded, quills carved from bone, pots of soot ink, hands stained black. The rustle of vellum and the scratching of quills formed a subtle music, punctuated by the distant murmur of knights in the courtyard. Two scholars, the monk Alcuin of York and Bishop Einhard, conversed in low voices. We must transcribe the Salic law into Latin and annotate it so local judges can understand, proposed Alcuin, tracing a precise line. Einhard nodded, placing his fingers on the first lines, careful to ensure the rigor of the words. When the copies were completed, Charlemagne summoned a solemn assembly at Diedenhofen. On the great square, paved with polished pebbles, a public tribunal was held. Peasants, drapers, innkeepers, and commoners crowded under a radiant sky, while a raven from the nearby woods flew over the scene like a silent messenger. The king, on horseback, observed the parade of plaintiffs. A Lorraine farmer disputed a grazing right with his neighbor. A Cologne merchant demanded restitution for a poorly weighed lot of silk. With each plea, the Missy raised a hand to call for order and attention. Charlemagne then pronounced the first sentence: "The pasture is common up to the stone marker per ancient custom, but what lies beyond belongs to he who maintains it." The words hung in the air, solid as stone, and the assembly murmured approval. When the silk merchant obtained justice through the strict application of imperial weights and measures, a cry of contentment rose. The heavy iron and bronze scales, inspected by the Missy, restored confidence to the people, ensuring that fraud would no longer cloud market life. The following autumn, the Missy Dominici took to the road again, crossing forests and marshes. Their hammered leather boots crunched on the Roman road, still covered in places with lichen and moss. In each villa they had charters drawn up, sealed with the royal seal, confirming property rights, corvée exemptions, and renewed penalties for those guilty of insult or theft. The scent of damp earth mingled with that of fresh leather as they chiseled the formula ad testem domini on church doors, a sign that the emperor's law extended even into the sanctuary. During a stop near an ancient venerable oak, the Missy camped under the stars. By the light of a crackling wood fire, they listened to an old man's tale, claiming he had dreamed of a white wolf carrying a parchment in its jaws, a sacred rune of eternal law. This story spread like a mystical murmur through the villages, reinforcing the belief that Carolingian law was inspired by a higher force. The embers glowed like eyes watching over the destiny of men. Upon returning to Aachen, Charlemagne ordered a new capitulary on criminal procedure. Thieves would be judged by 2 witnesses, public shaming before the church, and confiscation of goods. But widows and orphans would be protected by the state. The cathedral bell rang that day with a deep, solemn tone, as if blessing the morning announcement. The chancellors, lined up at the altar's foot, applied hot wax to the seals. The weight of red ink on the parchment seemed to engrave justice into the kingdom's flesh. In the years that followed, stone columns bearing the capitularies publicly sprouted in village squares. The emperor's law displayed prominently, inscribed for every passer-by to read. Innkeepers aligned copies on their counters, and church servants memorized these texts before the Gospels. Carolingian law, now rooted in daily life, shaped hearts and curbed the arbitrariness of the powerful. Thus was born the legend of a reign where the sword never crushed the weak without the counterbalance of equitable law. The rooting of Carolingian law, marked by the steps of the Missy and the tireless scratching of quills, would endure through the centuries. In the clamor of ages to come, these principles etched on parchment and village stones would remain the living legacy of one man's will to subject strength to reason and justice to clemency. Part 3. The Carolingian Renaissance. At the heart of the Aachen Palace, in a newly completed wing with walls covered in white stucco, the soft echo of quills caressing parchment resounded. The slanting rays of the autumn sun filtered through countless windows, arranged in bands, drawing a network of golden light on the floor, like an immaterial carpet, inviting meditation and study. The air was imbued with a subtle scent of beeswax candles and ink mixed with the dust of ancient books. In this studious silence, a few copyist monks, clad in humble burlap, raised their heads to watch their king walk among the rows of desks, where masterpieces of quill and miniature were born. Charlemagne advanced with a measured step, his purple wool toga trailing slightly, revealing fine Spanish leather shoes. With each step, the faint clink of his imperial ring resounded like a call to intellectual grandeur. He stopped before a station where an illuminator, an Italian from Ravenna named Pietro, worked, his fingers stained with pigments, crafting a depiction of the world on a folio, stylized continents, ancient monuments, and legendary creatures intertwined with lettered flourishes. The scent of Oliban, wafting from a smoking censer, lent the workshop an almost mystical aura. "Pietro," asked the king in a deep voice, "how progresses the copy of St. Augustine's De Civitate Dei?" "Sire," replied the artist without lifting his eyes, "each letter takes shape, and the reader, turning these pages, will feel the power of the word like a celestial surge. I reserve gold backgrounds for the major initials, so that divine light bursts forth at each chapter's start. In an adjacent corner, Alcuin of York supervised a class of young dignitaries. They sat before wax tablets, practicing Latin declensions. The muffled laughter of some students mingled with the crackle of a brazier, warming the workshop and casting a reddish glow that danced on heads crowned with decorative laurels. Alcuin, hand raised, corrected intonations, refined the meter of a verse, and explained the subtle difference between Roman rhetorical style and the purity of Christian prose. Further on, in the Imperial library, rows of varnished wooden shelves housed the first bound volumes of engraved leather. The highest shelf was reserved for sacred texts and the most precious secular works, Ptolemy's Geography, St. Jerome's Commentary on the Psalms, and medical treatises by Hippocrates and Galen translated into Latin. Charlemagne, accompanied by his librarian advisor Ansegisus, approached one of the volumes and caressed its binding. "These manuscripts," said the king, "are the foundation of our empire. As long as knowledge lives in these pages, our reign will shine beyond our borders." As dusk approached, a light bell rang. It was time for astronomy lessons, held in the western tower. There, an ancient Arab scholar, Al-Kindi, invited to the court after an embassy from Cordoba, expounded on the structure of celestial spheres. The students, eyes fixed on a chiseled bronze astrolabe, learned to calculate time by the stars' positions and predict eclipses. A portent was announced. A partial eclipse expected within the week would be recorded in the imperial annals as a sign of the kingdom's protection. When night fell, torches planted in iron chandeliers lit the labyrinthine corridors. Charlemagne left the scriptorium, crossed the courtyard of honor where the austere silhouette of the Palatine chapel stood out, and entered the throne room. There he received dignitaries from across Europe, Byzantine ambassadors, newly converted Saxon counts, Anglo-Saxon missionaries. The tables were set with silver goblets and plates of golden bread, offered as a sign of hospitality. Conversations alternated between learned Latin and guttural Germanic, testifying to the cultural diversity gathered under the Carolingian banner. In the center of the hall, a historical account was read aloud by a young cleric. It was the Chronicle of Fredegisus, recounting the mythical founding of Rome, the succession of Frankish kings, and the rise of Emperor Charles. Each sentence carried the solemnity of an oracle, and the listeners, captivated, savored the fusion of past and present. At the end of the reading, Charlemagne raised his goblet. To the memory of the ancients, the glory of the living, and the future of our heirs, may the light of knowledge always guide our steps. A thunder of applause echoed against the vaults, mingled with bursts of laughter and joyful murmurs. In this simple toast lay the tacit pact between the king and his people, to build an empire not only through war, but through culture and learning. As he returned to his chambers, Charlemagne passed a tapestry whose woven threads depicted the vision of the prophet Isaiah. The colors, still vibrant, formed a pictorial narrative, the promise of a pacified world under the scepter of justice. The king placed his hand on the cloth and paused for a moment, lost in contemplation of the details. Then he murmured, as if making an intimate vow, "May these threads unite men as words unite minds." Thus ended a day during which the Carolingian Empire, far beyond military conquests, found its most powerful vector in the quill, ink, and wisdom of the learned. The Carolingian Renaissance, awakened by the audacity of a prince become emperor, flourished to the rhythm of copyists, tutors, and scholars, preparing Europe for a golden age where culture and law would intertwine to shape the future. Chapter 4. The Eternal Legacy. Part 1. The Imperial Coronation. Travelers flocked to the Eternal City by the thousands, like an endless stream emerging from forgotten provinces. On the first day of January 800, as a late winter cast its sober veil over Rome, the city seemed to slumber under a mantle of silver mist. The murmuring fountains froze in places, their jets turning into shimmering stalactites, and the glazed tile roofs caught the first pink glints of a tardy dawn. From the Aventine Hill to the Capitoline, pilgrims draped in wool and fur advanced through the paved streets, carrying relics and vows, their hands stiffened by cold and their hearts swollen with hope. Charlemagne entered Rome at the head of a solemn convoy. His mount, a black war horse with a massive chest, trod the ancient ground with majesty. He was clad in a deep purple chlamys, lined with silver fox, fastened at the shoulder with a chiseled gold clasp. His helmet, adorned with peacock feathers plucked during a joust in Francia, gleamed in the diffuse light. Behind him, his counts carried the sword Joyeuse, now recognizable among 1,000 weapons, and his grand chamberlains unfurled heavy pavilions bearing the imperial eagle. The procession made its way through the crowd, packed into the Roman Forum, its peristyle columns draped in ivy and lichen. The monumental arches, witnesses to pagan grandeur, seemed to bow in salute to the new master of the West. The pilgrims sang an improvised Te Deum, their voices rising like a prayer to the leaden skies. At each crossroad, priests brandished vessels of holy water and lifted the hems of their chasubles to sprinkle the horses, as if to purify the millennial earth. The convoy halted before St. Peter's Basilica. The walls, topped by a detachment of Swiss guards, converted Byzantine mercenaries, radiated a lunar whiteness under a light frost. Inside, the aisles exhaled the acrid scent of oriental incense, its swirls rising to the unfinished frescoes. The circular columns bore capitals adorned with Latin verses and sculpted palmettes, remnants of ancient art reinvested by faith. The time-worn stained glass windows filtered crimson glimmers, painting scarlet halos on the polished marble. In the choir, Pope Leo III, clad in a golden dalmatic and a royal purple cloak, awaited on a bronze throne encrusted with semi-precious stones. His face, emaciated by trials, bore the gravity of the Last Judgment. At his side, 2 deacons supported a 6th century gospel book, bound in silver plates, adorned with gems and Paleo-Christian motifs. Silence fell, so intense that one could almost hear the breath of the stone. Charlemagne dismounted, his boots treading the sacred ground without a sound. He knelt before the Holy Father, and the choir intoned a soaring Kyrie, its notes wrapping like a sonic scarf toward the vault. Leo approached, took the gospel book, opened it to the page of the 4th gospel, and placed it on the emperor's head. With a slow gesture, he extended his hands and pronounced the solemn formula. Deus, qui regis gentes misericordia, hunc famulum tum ad imperi dignitatem perducat. The words, laden with solemnity, resonated like an ivory ornament cleaving the air. At this signal, 2 clerics raised an antique-style crown, encircled with garnets and fine pearls, onto the king's head. The crown, a work of Byzantine jewelers, was heavy enough to remind him of the responsibility of bearing the world's weight. As the metal rings closed, a ripple passed through the assembly like a wave traced by the divine hand. A sudden crash resounded. The organs, reconfigured for the event, burst into a monumental chord, making every stone of the basilica vibrate. The bells of Rome's other churches responded with a polyphonic carillon, their intertwined notes forming a song of triumph and supplication. The torches crackled, casting dancing shadows on the faithful's faces, heightening their fervor. The Pope then presented a golden paten containing a solemn host and offered it to Charlemagne. The emperor received it between his fingers, closed his eyes, and placed his lips on the Eucharistic bread, thus merging his earthly reign with sacramental grace. At that very moment, some swore they saw a ray of light filter through a stained glass window, illuminating the crown with a supernatural glow. The Frankish nobles and Roman senators knelt, striking the floor with their knees. The foreign ambassadors, Lombards, Saxons, Moors from Spain, Byzantines, watched in silence the moment a barbarian king became Caesar's successor. The official parchments, sealed with the seal of St. Peter and the Carolingian seal, were then read aloud in Latin and Greek. They declared the restoration of the Western Empire, the indissoluble union between the papacy and imperial dignity, and the promise to protect the Church against its enemies. After the ceremony, the emperor, supported by the Pope, circled the basilica. The faithful knelt to receive his blessing. Children offered him olive branches, symbols of peace, while soldiers cast their helmets at his feet as an offering. The maveks, mute slaves tasked with carrying imperial insignia, displayed the orb and scepter. representing temporal and spiritual power. Outside, on St. Peter's Square, a charitable meal was served to the poor. It featured steaming herb broth, rye bread, and fresh cheese offered under the guidance of bishops mindful of Christian mercy. As the smoke rose into the frosty sky, Charlemagne, standing on an improvised platform, addressed the assembled Romans. May the peace emanating from this day extend to all peoples. May our laws protect the poor. May our strength defend the weak. And may God guide our steps toward the glory of Christendom. His grave and measured tone convinced the last skeptics. The streets, usually dim in midwinter, filled with a chorus of voices singing an ancient hymn, evoking the celestial Jerusalem and the majesty of the Savior. The glow of torches and straw fires warmed faces as winter gradually retreated under a gentler breeze, as if nature itself saluted the birth of a new order. As the crowd dispersed, the emperor and pope returned to the basilica. There, in the restored silence, the treaty between the papacy and the new imperial authority was sealed. Scribes recorded the clauses: protection of the papacy, restitution of ecclesiastical goods, mutual assistance against barbarian invasions. Each line was signed with a quill dipped in gold, symbolizing the alliance of light and power. Thus ended the imperial coronation of Charlemagne. Rome, the millennial republic, bowed before the son of Gaul, and the West found itself united under a single toga for the first time since Rome's fall. The new emperor, now bearing the crown of Rome and the title of Augustus, held in his hand the legacy of a reborn world where faith, awe, and culture would form the framework of an empire destined to endure through the centuries. Part 2. The transmission of knowledge. At the heart of the Aachen Palace, in the spring of 802, the scriptorium resonated with the discreet rustle of parchments under the sharpened quills of copyists. The flickering light of oil lamps cast golden glimmers on the paneled walls, while the acrid scent of fresh ink and the faint smoke of incense mingled with the muffled warmth of embers. On long, dark wood tables, aligned like rows of a silent army, rare books from the libraries of Rome, the East, and Toledo were piled. Treatises on Latin grammar, Aristotle's commentaries, illuminated gospels, psalms sung in the new Roman chant, collections of Virgil and Cicero's works. Charlemagne, draped in a purple wool toga edged with gold thread, entered this sacred enclave. His step, measured and solemn, made the metal rings on his sword strap clink. The copyists raised their eyes, folded their scrolls, and the assembly fell silent, suspended in the emperor's shadow. At his side, Alcuin of York, dean of the Palatine School, advanced briskly, holding a thick codex bound in brown leather marked with the imperial seal. His gleaming metal spectacles cast furtive glints in the dim light. "A true treasure of antiquity," said the king in a deep voice. "These volumes will be reborn under your hands and enlighten our students. Let every word, every sentence be faithfully copied, for the permanence of the cultured world depends on your gestures." A murmur of approval ran through the scriptorium as Alcuin stepped forward. He solemnly placed the codex on an oak lectern, then raised his arms as if inviting the monks and laymen to draw closer. "Sire," he replied, In accordance with your admonitio generalis of 789, we establish here a court school to train not only the sons of nobles, but also the next clerics, charged with bringing the light of knowledge to every diocese of your empire. In a corner, a young Saxon student, kneeling before a wax tablet, patiently resumed Latin declensions. Daswig, his brow furrowed with concentration, quill in hand, inscribed each word as if fearing to lose it forever. At his side, a rare Frankish girl in the setting recited in a low voice the rules of Latin accentuation, an echo of a new pedagogy recognizing women's role in spreading knowledge. The king then gestured to his chancellor, who brought a blank parchment roll. Charlemagne unrolled it slowly before tracing with a steady hand the first lines of a new capitulary. Let schools be established in all major churches where every free child may learn to read, write, and sing the Psalms, and let competent masters teach grammar, scriptures, arithmetic, and the ars dictandi. Under the admiring eyes of the witnesses, he sealed the manuscript with a golden stamp. A scribe, his face trembling with emotion, took the quill to copy the formula, while squires moved through the workshop, replacing spent candles with smoking braziers. A bell suddenly chimed, announcing the arrival of new pupils. In the doorway, a delegation of children, Missi Dominici, advanced, carrying papyrus scrolls gathered from Arab or Byzantine scholars. Their clothes were stained with ink, and their faces bore the fatigue of travels and the pride of bearing a unique legacy. They laid at their feet treatises on astronomy by Al-Khwarizmi, excerpts from Ptolemy's geography, and antiphonaries from Marseille, snatched from the Mediterranean winds. When night fell, Charlemagne crossed the palace's silent corridors, escorted by flickering torches. He paused before the Palatine chapel, where a new organ had just been installed. The bronze pipes, polished like mirrors, caught the flame's reflections, and the air vibrated with a timid melody, a prelude to an enriched liturgy. By pressing the first key, the emperor sounded a clear note alone in the shadowed nave. The sound rose and faded into the vault, sending a shiver through those who heard it. Christian culture was now unfolding in all its forms. In the morning, the court gathered to celebrate the first public lesson. In the courtyard of honor, arranged as an open-air chapel, a white marble podium awaited teachers and students. Around it, covered porticos welcomed parents and vassals, curious to witness this new oracle. Alcuin spoke. Faithful subjects of the emperor, today we teach not only the written word, but also the virtue and wisdom of the ancients, so that this city may never be merely stone, but the hearth of an eternal flame. He raised an illuminated manuscript depicting Solomon rendering justice and explained its meaning to a captivated audience. The voices of students young and old redoubled in fervor to repeat the lessons, while mothers and fathers, humble and powerful alike, exchanged delighted glances. Educational milestones, carved in stone, now displayed the great principles of logic, rhetoric, astronomy, and arithmetic, inscribed in golden letters. The Missi Dominici, setting out again for the empire's farthest reaches, carried copies of this first manual, the Elementary Carolingiensis, like a torch destined to illuminate Saxon valleys, Lombard plains, and Frankish steppes. In each villa, schools opened, modest thatch and rough wooden desks, and freed children joined noble children to decipher together the mysteries of classical Latin. Thus, through Charlemagne's will and Alcuin's fervor, the transmission of Christian and pagan knowledge took root in daily life. The palace of Aachen became the hearth of a Renaissance whose embers would never die. And as Europe emerged from the shadows of darkness, each copied word, each illuminated page, and each lesson taught wove the fabric of a shared destiny, forever tied to the scribe's quill, the teacher's voice, and the hand of a prince consecrated by God to serve the light. Part 3. The Shadow of the Eagle. As the empire expanded, vaster than Charlemagne's boldest dreams, a subtle shadow, born of ambitious designs and the most secret rivalries, began to loom over the imperial throne. In the far reaches of Germania, in the deep, dark forests, counts had declared themselves ducales, raising their domains into principalities beyond the reach of the Missi Dominici. In Rome, jealous senators whispered that Pepin's son had become more Roman than Caesar himself, fearing the usurpation of their ancient privilege. Across the empire, the Carolingian eagle, so proud in its banners, now cast a menacing shadow that none knew how to contain. At the heart of Aachen, at the twilight of a summer already lulled by the song of cicadas, Charlemagne stood alone in the gallery of ambassadors. The white marble tiles, polished by guests from across the world, gleamed under golden torches. The walls, tapestried with frescoes depicting celestial victory, cast moving reflections on his face, now weathered by years. He gazed at the bronze eagle, wings spread, symbol of his universal power, but his eyes were veiled with a quiet unease. In the darkness of the silent corridors, the herald vital, bearer of provincial news, approached with muffled steps. Beneath his cloak he hid a parchment sealed with black wax, a grim sign of the message's gravity. Charlemagne greeted him with a discreet nod, and the herald slowly broke the seal, revealing a missive from Benevento. Hildebrand, Duke of Benevento, had concluded a secret treaty with Byzantium, opening his ports to the ruthless ships of the Eastern Empire. The treacherous alliance threatened Mediterranean supply lines and jeopardized the empire's very cohesion. A shiver ran down the emperor's spine. In the adjacent room, the shadows of ancient statues, brought to light by the imperial archaeologist Eginhard, seemed to stir and watch him. Charlemagne moved to the ogival window overlooking the courtyard of honor. The wind stirred the Carolingian banners, and the golden eagle seemed to bow under the uncertain breath of destiny. He murmured to himself, "When a duke betrays his oath, the entire edifice trembles." The next day, an emergency assembly was held in the great hall of the palace. Counts and bishops were summoned, their grave faces lit by torches aligned along the columns. On the platform, Charlemagne exposed the betrayal of Benevento. The oath bound Hildebrand to the emperor, not to the agitation of Byzantine fleets. This treaty is a sword turned against us. His voice's echo resounded like a knell, silencing the Lord's murmurs. Count Theobald of Champagne rose, his brow dark. "Sire, if we punish Hildebrand too harshly, other dukes might consider autonomy in turn, and we would lose the heart of the northern marches." His heavy, experienced words clashed with the emperor's obstinacy, whose gaze sparked with fire. "The Imperial pact," replied Charlemagne, "tolerates no treachery, even when faults hide in the shadows. Justice is the steel that tempers our cohesion." At these words, a flurry of scribes recorded the sentence on parchment: excommunication and confiscation of Benevento's lands. The Archbishop of Cologne, invoking Roman and canonical law, blessed the act, thus binding the Church's hand to the empire's. The clerics sealed the decrees with a solemn gesture, and the Frankish guards sheathed their lances, ready to execute the imperial will. In the night that followed, Charlemagne embarked on a ride to southern Italy. Accompanied by his personal guard, he crossed the Apennines under a starry sky, the gallop of horses resounding like a call to loyalty. Along their path, weary but ever faithful inhabitants lit bonfires, showing their unwavering fidelity. Yet, as the column advanced, the shadow of the Carolingian eagle grew, threatening the fragile balance between authority and rebellion. Arriving at Benevento, Charlemagne presented himself before the imposing walls, once erected by the Lombards. The setting sun cast a coppery light on the ramparts, so intense it evoked living embers. In the ducal palace's courtyard, Hildebrand, stripped of his insignia, awaited, surrounded by his last supporters. His gaze, far from submissive, reflected the defiance of a man who believed he acted for the good of his lands. "Duke," said the emperor in a deep voice, "you have sold our alliance to foreigners. Your betrayal has sown doubt in the hearts of the people. Repair your oath or face the justice you have defied." Hildebrand, his hand resting on the battle sword inherited from his Lombard ancestors, replied with defiance, "I have betrayed neither my people nor my blood. If the eastern seas offer the prosperity Aachen can no longer guarantee, I prefer to live as a free man than a humbled vassal." Silence fell, heavy as damp stone. Then Charlemagne signaled the guards to step aside. Advancing with a slow step, he observed Hildebrand as one gauges an adversary. Then, in an almost tender gesture, he placed his hand on his shoulder. "Duke Hildebrand, I have met you in the dust of roads and the ink of chanceries. I know the pride that drives you, yet never forget that a broken oath gnaws at the very throne that pronounces it. Rise again. Return to the circle of the empire, and we will welcome you not as a subject, but as a brother." The words, imbued with a mercy rarely known in him, touched Hildebrand. In his fierce eyes a crack appeared. He slowly bowed his head, accepting the offered pardon. At that moment, the bronze eagle, suspended in the palace gallery, seemed to spread its wings under the light of a waning ray, as if blessing the reconciliation. Night fell, and the imperial camp settled around the ramparts. A solemn feast reunited the repentant duke and his men, now reintegrated into the fold. Sweet dishes, blending Italian flavors and Frankish game, were served, and the trumpets played a new melody, the hymn of restoration. Yet, at the camp's edge, the herald vital received a parchment from the east. The Byzantines, irritated at seeing their traitor reclaimed, were already plotting to take Hildebrand's life. The shadow of the eagle extended, taking the form of an invisible wolf with sharp fangs. Charlemagne understood that each moral victory would be followed by a new challenge, and that power to endure must balance the steel of authority with the finesse of forgiveness. In the morning he issued a new edict. Let no duke choose freedom outside the imperial fold. Let the oath be the purple that binds a man to the empire's destiny. The copies, sent to all Castellanes, were read publicly, reminding all that Carolingian sovereignty rested as much on the given word as on the strength of arms. Returning to Aachen, Charlemagne stood before the gallery of ambassadors, under the bronze bird with spread wings. He raised his arms toward the horizon, where the hills blended, and murmured, "May the shadow of the eagle sometimes herald the light." The eagle then seemed to shine with a rare brilliance, as if the universe itself had heard the king's promise, to govern not only by power, but by wisdom, in the fragile balance between shadow and light, authority and mercy. At the end of this long journey, Emperor Charles, known as Charlemagne, remains the embodiment of an ideal both martial and scholarly, forged by the steel of conquest and the ink of copyists. A man of contrasts, he blended the ruggedness of a warlord with the refinement of an enlightened patron. His voice, sometimes thunderous on the battlefield, softened into gentle authority when reprimanding his advisers or encouraging his students in the Palatine schools. His life was a bridge spanning the ages. On one side, he restored Roman order by crowning the Western Empire, reconnecting with ancient grandeur. On the other, he infused a militant faith, reforming the church, protecting the clergy, and imposing baptism on pagan peoples. Through the Admonitio Generalis and the Capitularies, he etched into stone and parchment a common law, guaranteeing equality before the law and curbing the arbitrariness of lords. Militarily, he extended his borders from the Pyrenees to the Elbe's banks, subdued Lombards, Saxons, and Avars, and repelled Muslim incursions in Spain. But perhaps his most enduring mark was left in the field of culture. Under his aegis, the Carolingian Renaissance flourished, where calligraphy, liturgical music, and ancient knowledge thrived. At the twilight of his reign, the Carolingian eagle soared over a unified, pacified, and awakened Europe. Rural schools, scribal monasteries, and royal palaces became hearths of knowledge, and restored Roman roads, fostered trade and communication. In his gaze lingered the rigor of the legislator, the compassion of the protector of the weak, and the audacity of the conqueror. An epitaph of the nascent medieval world, Charlemagne died in 814, entrusting to his son Louis the legacy of an empire whose brilliance would never fully fade, that of a king-emperor whose name remains, through the centuries, synonymous with justice, faith, and cultural rebirth. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.